Hello, everyone, and welcome to the North Shore Drive Fantasy Football Favorites podcast for Week 2. I'm your host, Dalton Brown, joined here, as I am every week, by Chris Dell, our fantasy football guru, Post-Gazette sports editor and fantasy football analyst. Chris, it's an exciting time for fantasy football managers. For those of you who don't know, Chris last year won first place out of 235 analysts in the FantasyPros Fantasy Football NFL Draft Accuracy Rankings competition. And Chris, some exciting news for you too. Congrats on the Week 1 success. Chris finished top five out of 200 people, more than 200 people, I think, right, on Fantasy Pros in Week 1. How's it feeling?
Yeah, man, you're just happy to have a good week with the rankings. We publish my top 150, actually, that we talk about here in the show. By the end of the week, by Sunday, when they're finalized, we run them in our Post-Gazette Sunday newspaper, as well as on the website at post-gazette.com. So it's always an honor to place in the top 5, top 10, top 20, even out of the very smart analysts that are in this competition in these weekly accuracy ranks that Fantasy Pros does. So it was very humbled and proud to be number 1 in last year's draft rankings, and then to have it also be a top 5 finish in Week 1, number 5 exactly. I was very happy about that. But really, to me, Dalton, as we mentioned on the last show, like, this is all about, like, fantasy season starts now. Like, Week 1 happened, okay, like, even if we just hit 50% of what we predicted, I think we're in a good spot, and now we can really adjust to the data, where I think most of your opponents are going to be way too slow to adapt. And this is really where you take advantage. I posted a Twitter thread, I think it was Sunday night, Monday morning, that got a lot of views. And it was valuable because I went through all the PFF box score data about routes run, snaps played, and really went into like, hey, like, a lot of bad fantasy football teams won on Sunday in Week 1, and a lot of good fantasy football teams lost. And by no means is this the end of the season or the end all be all. Because a lot of people are going to overreact, and we got to know when to react based off the data, and also when to adjust our priors that we came into with the draft season as well. So I'm ready to dive in, man.
Yeah, and I want to touch on the hometown Steelers as well first. Obviously kind of a little bit of a strange win from a fantasy perspective. I think the Steeler that you would have most wanted to own last week was Chris Boswell. Had himself quite a game. Steelers winning 18-10 on the road in Atlanta in Week 1. Without scoring a touchdown on offense. So, I mean, talk to me about kind of your fantasy implications for the Steelers and your thoughts on some of their guys moving forward.
Yeah, we talked about a couple different things, and basically what it came down to at the end was, I think we only were going to buy into the running backs so far to this point. And George Pickens to an extent, like we know the talent is there with Pickens, and he had a decent game overall. The one guy I really was fading in terms of we talked about this before the draft a couple weeks ago. We talked about this last week for Week 1 was Pat Freiermuth overall. And at the end of the day, Pat Freiermuth, yes, he was out there and he ran a decent amount of routes, but he was also splitting routes with other tight ends on the roster. McCole Pruitt ran 11 routes overall in the game. Darnell Washington ran 8 routes. So we see the prototypical Arthur Smith offense where he likes to feed the one big bruising back. He did it with Derrick Henry. He did it kind of in a different way last year where he fed Tyler Algier more than people wanted to. They wanted to go to all to Bijan, but Algier was like the bigger bruising type of grinder back. And that's what Najee Harris is in this offense. So yes, I do believe that Jaylen Warren at the end of the day, better days are ahead. But this could be more of like a 65-35 split, 60-40 at best for Jaylen, even when he's healthy, because this is the type of back that Arthur Smith wants to ride in Najee. And think about it financially, Dalton. Like, we talked about this on our North Shore Drive episodes with Chris Carter and the rest of our guys, Jerry Dulac, Ray Fittipaldo, Brian Bacco, et cetera, our Steelers beat reporters here, is the financial implications of Najee Harris, of them openly early in the process in the offseason, not giving him a new contract. They've got a free ride right now. Like, they don't need to pay Najee Harris right now. They've got him for the full season. They're going to use him as much as humanly possible and probably wind up extending and giving a new contract to Jaylen Warren in the offseason and really just keeping him fresh this year. And I really think that's how it's going to break down. So they're going to get the most out of Najee Harris. And I came into the draft into week 1 kind of ranking them almost back-to-back. I'm going to have Najee Harris for the foreseeable future ranked a decent amount ahead of Jaylen Warren. And you don't have to look at the underlying data. Just look at the overall touches that we saw, from these two teams in week 1. And it was just a huge difference. Jaylen Warren was involved through the air in terms of like him running a decent amount of routes, but we really also needed to get those early down carries, those between the tackles plays. So that concerned me. Najee, 38 snaps, 12 routes. He had 22 targets and carries combined in the game. Jaylen Warren had 4. So I'm going to be ranking Najee Harris as like a low-end RB2, depending on the matchup. And I think they have a great matchup on the ground against a Denver team that's really struggled to contain opposing ground games. We saw what Kenneth Walker did to them in week 1. And they were ran all over in 2023 as well. So I think Najee's due for a big game here. Cross your fingers. You're not cutting Jaylen Warren. You're keeping him stashed on your bench because he's a high upside player. And God forbid something happens to Najee Harris, then Jaylen Warren really becomes interesting here. But I don't think we're going to see that 50-50 committee. Could be wrong. And honestly, I hope I'm wrong because I drafted more Jaylen Warren than I did Najee Harris. So that's my biggest pre-draft prior type of adjustment in terms of what opinions am I changing. Pat Freiermuth, he doesn't have a high enough ceiling for me, especially when 3 different tight ends are going to be running routes. That takes away the red zone opportunities when they do get down there for Pittsburgh in this offense, whether it's Justin Fields or Russell Wilson at quarterback. So the skill player-wise, I think boost for Najee, obvious downgrade for Jaylen Warren. I'm still keeping him on my bench. Pat Freiermuth, I'm dropping him to waiver wires. I've seen all I needed to see. All the targets that are going to be worth our while in fantasy are going to go to George Pickens. And because of that, I'm going to have a slight downgrade on George Pickens in week 2 because he's likely to be shadowed by Patrick Surtain in Denver, like the one elite player they do have on that defense. I still think Pickens can make plays, but he will get a slight downgrade in the rankings because of that. And obviously the quarterback situation is a different beast. You're going to stash Justin Fields if you have him, or if he's available on waiver wires, absolutely. For me, Justin Fields, if he's going to play this week, I would have him as like a low-end quarterback 1. Like as of right now, assuming he's going to start, obviously, I've got him sandwiched kind of in that Dak Prescott, Tua Tagovailoa, Joe Burrow range. We saw 14 QB runs by Fields. If he does that, then more often than not, he's going to hit pay dirt. And that's going to pay off big time for fantasy football teams. So Justin Fields, I think, can be a stopgap starter for you if you've got a guy in a tough matchup like we talked about this past week, having guys like Brock Purdy against the Jets, Dak Prescott against the Browns, and things like that. So I definitely think he should not be on waivers. But those are the only guys. Like Pickens, Najee, Justin, maybe Jaylen Warren down the road. It's a very highly concentrated target tree in Pittsburgh, and I just don't see any of the other guys, whether it's Calvin Austin, Van Jefferson. They're just simply not getting a high enough target share to matter in Pittsburgh. So it's really more simple at the end of the day in terms of what we want to do with these guys.
Well, sounds good. I mean, obviously, for the Steelers, the offense hasn't really been the story so far, anyway. So, hopefully they can head out to Denver and keep the momentum going. Certainly, 2 straight road wins to start the season would be a pretty good sign of things to come. Let's jump into some players that we feel particularly positive about, given their week 2 matchup and given what we saw in week 1. We'll go position by position here through some players who we want to start, some sits and some quits, meaning players that we're particularly high on, low on, and then maybe some that you should just give up on. So, we'll start on the positive end, and we'll start at the quarterback position. Chris, who are some guys that you think are in a particularly good spot this week heading into week 2?
Yeah, I really just want to play into the matchups with this stuff because as of right now with the quarterbacks, I don't have too much of a difference in my top 10 or 12 in terms of who are your QB1s. Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts are at the top. We all know that. We don't need to talk about those guys. You know how high I've been on Anthony Richardson and Jayden Daniels. I told you from day one, it's not going to look pretty. It didn't look pretty in week 1 passing the ball, but it sure looked pretty in the box score if you had them in your fantasy teams. And I got them ranked 3 and 4, right behind those 2 elite guys in Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. For me, in terms of a couple guys I'm higher or lower on. I'll go one higher and one lower. One guy I'm really high on this week, and I really like the game environment. I'm higher on both quarterbacks in the expert consensus rankings at Fantasy Pros, the ECR, which is the average of all the other analysts in the industry and their weekly rankings. I got Kyler Murray one spot ahead of ECR at QB5, and I have Matthew Stafford 5 spots ahead of ECR at QB8. And really just comes down to the matchup and the fact that these two teams, Arizona specifically, has maybe the worst secondary in all of football. And you look at the total in this game, we got a 48.5 point total, one of the highest on the slate in week 2. Yes, a lot of offenses struggled in week 1, but these defenses have so many holes, and I trust the quarterback and play calling to, even though there's no Puka, even though there's offensive line injuries for the Rams. Matthew Stafford is a wide receiver elevator as a quarterback. Sean McVay knows how to scheme up those things, and I don't think Arizona's defense is going to be able to take advantage. So for me, Matthew Stafford and Jared Goff, they're in my top 10, as is Baker Mayfield. Dak Prescott had a really good game in week 1. He's up against a tough defense at home in the Saints in week 2. I'm not flat out benching them, but I like those 3 guys as traditional pocket passers, and they're facing pass funnel secondaries. Baker Mayfield at Detroit, Goff in that same game at home against the Buccaneers pass funnel secondary. So I've got those guys ahead of your more household names like Tua at QB 13. I've got Burrow significantly lower this week. I've got Stroud 8 spots below consensus at QB 16. He's the guy I'm lowest on because I'll tell you what, there's no fluke of why Will Levis only threw for about 130 yards in that game. This Bears secondary and defense overall is absolutely legit. And Stroud, took a little while to get going in week 1. So while I'm really high on Stroud for the season, if I've got one of these other guys on waivers or on my bench, I'm starting them ahead of Stroud in week 2, just because the Bears are one of those defenses. Like, I can only count a few of them on my hand that I would truly fade a quarterback in if they're not a rushing quarterback. And Chicago is one of them in week 2. So those are the guys overall that I'm highest and lowest on heading in from week 1 to week 2.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the Stafford Murray, I love that you're high on those 2 guys. I mean, the Rams and Cardinals, I think, are 2 teams right now that are a little bit beat up. The Rams, especially on the offensive line. But what I think is going to be a result of that, I think you're going to see Stafford getting the ball out quickly, and you're going to see the Rams throwing the ball a lot. So I think it makes a ton of sense. I'm sure we'll get to it as we go along, but I mean, Cooper Kupp last week, 21 targets. Are we sure he's not going to end up close to that this week? We'll get to that as we go along.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, no other pass catcher in the league had more than 12 targets in week 1, and Cooper Kupp has 21. So, I think that the Rams know how to play this way. They've had offensive line injuries for years now. The key thing is that Stafford's healthy. Another key thing is that we'll talk about our sleepers a little bit later in the show with wide receivers, but Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson, I think, deserve to be owned in most leagues that are 12 teams or more, I would say. Because if one of these guys becomes at least like a semi 1B to Cooper Kupp, and we saw them both have productive fantasy outings in week 1, any receiver that plays with Matthew Stafford is going to exceed expectations more often than not. And I think those 2 guys fit the mold to where they can be like a Puka light for the time being. Because as of right now, it looks like Puka's going to wind up – he's on IR. He's going to miss at least 4 games. All the reports are saying he's likely to miss maybe 6 to 8 weeks or more. So we're going to be without Puka Nacua for a couple months. And I think Demarcus Robinson and Tyler Johnson, at least for now, they're in the pole position to really soak up a lot of those targets that he's going to leave behind.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure we'll talk about Colby Parkinson as well. Let's jump over to running backs. And talk about some guys that you're particularly higher than the market on. A couple that stick out to me. I mean, obviously, Zach Charbonnet, you've got him 27 spots higher than ECR. Obviously, that's because of the injury concern with Kenneth Walker. So I'm not going to, we don't need to harp on that one too much. But one that sticks out to me, especially Ramondre Stevenson, you've got him 5 spots ahead of ECR. Jordan Mason, 9 spots ahead of ECR. Talk about some of your favorite guys this week.
Yeah, so the Jordan Mason one is tricky because Christian McCaffrey was limited in practice today. It's only Wednesday, right? Adam Schefter strongly suggested the other night on the broadcast that McCaffrey could miss week 2. And there have been reports to say that they really like how Jordan Mason played. They trust him, and that they don't necessarily feel like they have to bring Christian McCaffrey back for week 2. Kyle Shanahan said if this was a playoff game in week 1, he would have played. The thing concerning to me is that it was a calf injury at first. Those things can scare me at times, especially – I think we saw this actually – I mean, this is a different sport, but it's still sports regardless. Like we saw this with Giannis Antetokounmpo in the NBA. We're betting player props on him and whatnot and playing fantasy there too. He had a calf injury for most of the year, and then all of a sudden you see on the injury report the word Achilles start to sneak in. Calf / Achilles, and that's what we're starting to see with Christian McCaffrey now is they're adding the word Achilles to the injury report. So that scares me a little bit, especially at his age, with the mileage that's been put on his tires, so to speak. So I think that, yes, when he's back, he's going to be a locked-in starter. He's going to be, at worst, top 3 next to Bijan and Breece Hall. So that's why I've got Jordan Mason ranked right now as if he's going to be the starter and McCaffrey's going to be out, which would put him right around running back 10. Albeit, not the greatest matchup in the world on the road against a solid Vikings run defense, but I still think with the usage there, he had all 28 of the running back touches in week 1. Absolute monster workhorse for Jordan Mason. And just moving down, as you mentioned, like Zach Charbonnet, Kenneth Walker missed practice today for Seattle. I think he's going to practice at some point this week, but if for some reason that injury becomes worse, Zach Charbonnet is like the only backup they trust that they have left on that roster. So I would be very high on him and rank him as a locked-in top 20 running back for week 2. So make sure that he's not available on your waiver wire as well. I just was like, I was wrong about Ramondre in week 1. I was lower on him than consensus. I had a lot of hits. He was one of my misses for sure. And the usage was absolutely outstanding for Ramondre. And I think what we saw is that, hey, you know what? The Patriots might not be able to throw the ball at all, but at least they can run a decent bit, and their defense is solid. And I think that if they can stick to that, kind of like how the Steelers like to win those ugly type of games, they can have a little bit of success on the ground. So Stevenson, when you compare him to Antonio Gibson, who also had 7 carries in the game, Stevenson ran 21 routes. Gibson only ran 3 routes. Stevenson outcarried Gibson 26-7, outsnapped him 51-13. So we're seeing workhorse usage for Ramondre. And I've got Ramondre in this range where, like, once you get to RB 17, 18, the workhorse backs end. Like Joe Mixon at 17, I've got him 8 spots lower than consensus, but it's because of that Bears defense that I was talking about earlier. I'm downgrading all my Texans this week, really outside of the wide receivers with Nico Collins. And then once you get past that, you get into the 50-50 committee guys. Like, I really like J.K. Dobbins this week with the matchup. We saw he's fully healthy in week 1. As long as he's healthy, at Carolina, maybe the worst run defense in the league, he's at least 1 spot above consensus right now for me, and I think I might move him higher as the week progresses and we get some clarity on some of these injuries. David Montgomery, Najee Harris, Brian Robinson, all guys with plus matchups that I have ranked between 19 to 21 as well. One guy after that, Rachaad White, I'm 6 spots lower than consensus on him, really just because we saw the rookie Bucky Irving come in and really make a big statement on the ground with his rushing efficiency and yards per carry metric. He was explosive, and we've seen Rachaad White continue to be one of the least efficient running backs in the league in terms of early down carries. We could at some point see soon a 50-50 committee where Rachaad White might just become at some point relegated to being the pass catching back for Tampa Bay and what looks to be a pretty explosive offense so far. So those are some of my initial adjustments in terms of guys I'm higher or lower on in that top 24, top 25. These are the running backs you're going to probably be starting on a week-to-week basis, and those are the guys that kind of moved up and down a little bit based on what we saw in week 1.
Yeah, it's interesting. Obviously, it's because of the Bears defense, so I understand why you've got Mixon that low. But, I mean, from a usage perspective last week, 30 carries sticks out like a sore thumb to me. 30 carries for 159 yards. Now, he was only targeted 3 times in the pass game, but anytime I see a guy get 30 carries, that's a dude that's getting leaned on. So I'm interested to see, how that turns out for him. Another guy that I want to ask you about, because I think I'm higher on him than most of the market, is Jerome Ford. And the reason that I'm as high as I am, 7 targets last week. He's clearly the bell cow back in Cleveland. And to me, this is a dude who we saw had 18 touches, including 7 targets, in a game where Cleveland was playing from way behind the whole game. When they're in a maybe even a neutral-ish game script, until Nick Chubb, if he comes back, when he comes back, to me, Jerome Ford feels like a bell cow back that's worth consideration, and a guy that I would start as an RB2. Tell me why I'm wrong.
No, I don't think you're wrong at all, Dalton. I mean, I've got him RB24, which is right in that borderline RB2 range, right? Like, I've got him one spot behind Aaron Jones, one spot ahead of Tony Pollard, who actually looked really good himself. He finds himself in another tough matchup against the Jets in week 2. Zach Moss is in that range. I mentioned Rachaad White. You know, the guys from what I mentioned, Joe Mixon. The guys ranked 1 through 17 for me, there's a clear cutoff because those are all guys we can see get 20-plus touches per game. You mentioned, obviously, the targets with Joe Mixon. Yes, that's a thing where he's maybe not used as much in the passing game as we want because those receivers are so good. And the touchdown equity for Joe Mixon is going to be there. Like, that's when you're going to win and win big with Mixon, is because you know they're going to use him at the goal line. Indianapolis and Chicago, complete opposites in terms of defenses. So I don't think we're going to see that 5.3 yards per carry clip like we saw in week 1, but he still scored a touchdown. I don't know. We're going to see how that winds up playing out here in week 2, and I might wind up kind of forcing him closer to top 10 than in that 15 to 20 range in the future. I still don't want to overreact just the 1 week as well. Ford, going back to him, like, Jacksonville's got a pretty solid run defense themselves. They really bottled up the Dolphins running backs on the ground in week 1. Etienne got there in fantasy and he scored a touchdown, but he struggled on the ground too. I thought they would at least have a couple of explosive runs, and they did not against Jacksonville. And Jacksonville had a pretty stout run defense last year as well. I think you'd almost rather want Jerome Ford in a negative game script, Dalton, because you want those targets, you want those easy catches, you want those PPR points. So I don't think that's a bad thing. I think Jerome Ford's going to be there no matter what. It's just the issue with me of ranking him higher, at least for now, is like, how many touchdowns can we count on from the Browns on a week-to-week basis with how bad Deshaun Watson looks? If you're going to give me Jameis Winston and he's playing well and not turning the ball over like crazy, then I think Ford moves up a little bit for me, because I'm pretty down on Winston, as most people are after that week 1 performance. So that's kind of my take on guys like him in that range, like Jerome Ford, Zach Moss from the Bengals. I actually moved Travis Etienne really far down the board. When you look at the overall usage, he fumbled late in the second half in that game against the Dolphins, and they gave Tank Bigsby way more carries than him after that. Tank Bigsby was way more explosive on the ground. We heard all offseason that the Jaguars coaches, yes, they knew Tank Bigsby had a terrible rookie year. He dropped passes, he fumbled the ball, but you know what? They still drafted him in the 3rd round 2 years ago, and they're giving him every single chance because they don't want to give Travis Etienne a full workload. They want to preserve him. They've said this publicly before. So Etienne, I've got my lowest running back of the week in terms of the top 25, top 30 guys. I've got him 11 spots lower than consensus at RB28. I don't like the matchup against the Browns. I think they're going to show much better than they did against Dallas in week 1. And I think you're going to see Tank Bigsby try to force a 50-50 committee here, and he might actually just be the better runner, pure runner in this backfield period. So Rachaad White and Travis Etienne, man, if you can somehow get out of those guys and trade them away to maybe an RB-needy team, at this point, obviously the draft cost is way different. I'd much rather buy low on a young Tank Bigsby or Bucky Irving than hold on to like these household name running backs that we've seen in past years deliver for us, like Rachaad White or Travis Etienne. I do not like the long-term outlooks for those running backs right now at all.
Let's jump over to wide receivers. Obviously a lot to talk about here. One of the biggest pieces of news coming out of last week is the Puka Nacua injury and how that affected the workload of Cooper Kupp, who turned into, like we talked about, Just a
He
target
turned
hog.
into Cooper Kupp, dog. Cooper Kupp turned into Cooper Kupp.
A target hog like we haven't seen since Cooper Kupp of a few years ago. But, let's talk about some guys that you're particularly high on going into week 2. A couple guys that stick out to me when I take a look at your rankings. We get closer to the top. You've got Garrett Wilson all the way up at wide receiver 3 this week in PPR scoring. And then Devontae Smith and Brandon Aiyuk, Devontae Adams, these are all guys that you're about 5 spots ahead of ECR on. What is it about these guys that makes them particularly attractive to you this week?
Yeah, I think you look at so Devontae Adams, Brandon Aiyuk. I mean, Brandon Aiyuk, I think, is in a fantastic matchup this week. He was up against Sauce Gardner-Johnson in week 1. Jets may be the best secondary in the league. We knew that the 49ers passing game was going to struggle a little bit. The gadgety guys, like the short intermediate guys, Kittle and Debo, they had decent games. Brandon Aiyuk struggled. He dropped a couple passes. This is a Vikings secondary that was torched a lot last year, and I think that he's going to have his way, especially in the man coverage type of looks deeper down the field for Purdy. I think they're going to connect, at least have a chance to connect on a couple deep shots in this matchup as well, on a fast track there at Minnesota. So I'm boosting Brandon Aiyuk. Still a couple spots lower than Debo, but they're both locked-in starters essentially. You have to be in like an 8 to 10 team league to have like 3 better guys to start than Brandon Aiyuk, in my opinion, this week. Cooper Kupp, I've got him at wide receiver 9. Probably going to move that up. I basically got him behind like the consensus top 8 we had coming into the draft, right? Like those guys we talked about. Garrett Wilson was at the end of that tier. At the same time, Garrett Wilson's going up against a pass funnel Tennessee Titans secondary where they gave up the most yards. They were in the bottom of the league in terms of yards, passing yards, receiving yards allowed in 2023. We just didn't see Caleb Williams and the Bears take advantage of that in week 1. So I think that this is a get-right game for the Jets passing attack, and we're not going to, as good as Allen Lazard looked in week 1, and we know the connection between him and Rodgers, we're not going to see that every week either. So I think Garrett Wilson, this is a get-right game for him as Rodgers' top target. But yeah, man, those are, it's really matchup-based with those guys. Like the top 20, top 24, I'm going to make certain adjustments here and there. I did bump Marvin Harrison down a few spots. He was double teamed essentially almost the entire game against Buffalo. Coaches said it after the game. If he would have caught that, if he would have been throwing the ball on that deep touchdown late, he was completely wide open. We all saw the highlight. We're not even talking about him as being like a concern heading into week 2, but that's what happened. He only had 1 catch, a couple targets, and that's where we are. So I don't want to overreact too much, but I did bump him down a few spots compared to where I had him in week 1. And those are some of the guys. Like I still like Nico Collins. I got him at wide receiver 16, 4 spots below consensus technically, but you know what? It's a tough matchup. And I'm just downgrading him a little bit. I'm not saying to bench him in that case. Like one guy I really like when you start getting into like the wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3/flex, the guys you will need to make decisions on that I think could be actionable here on this show before we move on to tight end. Jameson Williams, to me, Dalton, has become a fantasy starter. It's not a question anymore. I wanted to be aggressive on him this week because when you look at his college draft prospect profile coming into the league, he was an elite wide receiver prospect coming out of Alabama. Struggled with things, was suspended, was in the doghouse last year. Now you can see clips of him like blocking in week 1, and Dan Campbell gives him the game ball. He's fully bought into the culture, and we saw him be the elite target earner in Detroit in week 1 to where Amon-Ra St. Brown was relegated to being a bust overall. So I want to be aggressive. Now, look, I'm still ranking Amon-Ra above Jameson Williams for now, but Jameson Williams led the Lions in targets with 9, 121 receiving yards, 5 catches, had a long touchdown at 52. We know that can happen any play. And he had a 13-yard carry. So I think that Laporta, St. Brown, they're going to have bounce-back games, obviously, but to me, Jameson Williams, could move even higher than this in future weeks. I got him at wide receiver 22. Right after Marvin Harrison, I got Cooper, Chris Godwin, Jameson Williams. I got Jameson Williams 1 spot ahead of Zay Flower, 2 spots ahead of Xavier Worthy, Tank Dell, George Pickens. That's the range I want Jameson Williams in. With this Lions offense in the dome, in good weather with a great offensive line, they're going to score points all year long consistently. And if I don't have one of the two running backs outside of Amon-Ra St. Brown, like it's J-Mo and it's Laporta. And those guys are all going to be viable starters by the end of the year. So I moved Jameson Williams. He's right now consensus wide receiver 33. I've got him at wide receiver 22. So that's one of my biggest differences this weekend into week 2.
Couple things that I want to touch on here before we go to tight ends. First, my hot take at the wide receiver position that I'm going to get out there now is I think for the time being, Cooper Kupp is at worst wide receiver 2 for week 2. And it sounds nuts, but heading into this matchup with Arizona, I think the Rams are going to be throwing the whole day.
Yeah.
And we already know Stafford's going to be looking for him every single play. And I get that, we don't want to overreact. Those top 8 guys are the top 8 guys for a reason, but I'm hard pressed to see, a Jamar Chase outperforming him this week. I'm hard pressed to imagine, even like a CeeDee Lamb or Garrett Wilson, guys who I know we believe in, really strongly. I think in this current moment in this matchup, it's there's almost nobody I'd rather have than Cooper Kupp outside of maybe Tyreek Hill this week. That's where I'm at with him.
Sure. And I agree with you. I think this becomes more of a DFS conversation, right? Because you're not benching Cooper Kupp. And I totally agree. I'm way more confident in Cooper Kupp than Jamar Chase, and I absolutely will make that swap compared to what I had early in the week because I work through these rankings every day. They're updated every day on the website. Ahead of Amon-Ra St. Brown against the Bucks, Mike Evans at Detroit. These guys have great matchups in week 1. Maybe Justin Jefferson, a little bit of tougher matchup against San Francisco. But they've given up a lot of yards to wide receivers. That's kind of their one soft spot by design in San Francisco there. So, he's right up there with those guys. Cooper Kupp is now officially in that top 8. You can take Jamar Chase out for now as Burrow deals with this wrist injury, as Chase deals with food poisoning and missing practice and all these other things going on with my Bungles right now. So I would definitely put Kupp above Chase for now, but you're starting both still at the end of the day as a lesson after that. A couple guys I think you could make a decision on this week before we move on. I'll go through these guys real quick, Dalton. Drake London at Philly. If he doesn't get right against this Eagles secondary, which has given up a ton of yards in production, even in week 1 against Green Bay, I would not have much faith for the rest of the season unless there's a quarterback change from Cousins to Penix. I've got London at wide receiver 28. That's not a bench. That's a wide receiver 3. If you got 3 wide receiver spots, that means wide receiver 28 means he's either in your wide receiver 3 spot, or if you're in a 2 wide receiver starting league, that means he's in your flex or a flex candidate. So I've moved them from that locked in wide receiver 2 to down in that range. He's not a straight up bench yet, but it's possible you could have a roster where you've got Xavier Worthy, Jameson Williams, DJ Moore, and you're starting those guys over Drake London, in my opinion, without a doubt, in week 2. Another guy is Michael Pittman. Look, the preseason shows we did last year, one of the guys I was fading the most at wide receiver was Michael Pittman, because I knew that Anthony Richardson, run first quarterback, you're going to see those target shares dip at the wide receiver position. Now, what happened? I was wrong at the end of the year, but it was because Anthony Richardson got hurt and he was out for the year. When we saw more of a traditional drop back passer in Gardner Minshew become the quarterback there and lifted all the numbers for the receiver. This is assuming Anthony Richardson stays healthy, obviously, and I think if he does, we're going to see a continued, yes, Pittman will lead the Colts in targets and in all the metrics and all the stats this year, but it's going to be a lot less than what we saw in 2023. He had a wide receiver finish overall in week 1. He had 8 targets, which is great, but 4 catches for 31 yards. He was wide receiver 60 on the week. And Anthony Richardson was 9 for 19 passing, Dalton. But the passes he connects on are the deep bombs, the 54-yard touchdown to Ashton Dulin, the long touchdown, to Alec Pierce. He could have had another long touchdown to the rookie Adonai Mitchell from Texas. So, Pittman's actually the one guy who might actually see the biggest downgrade, where you're going to see those random spike weeks where next week Adonai Mitchell might have 3 catches for 120 yards and 2 touchdowns. And Pittman just keeps grinding out 5 for 68 targets. And I don't really want that ceiling when I'm talking about one of my locked-in starters week to week. So him. One other guy I'm concerned about is Chris Olave. In that offense, like we saw a huge bounce back for the Saints in terms of Kubiak running the show there. A lot of pre-snap motion, similar to the rates we see with the smartest minds in the league, Sean McVay, Kyle Shanahan, Mike McDaniel. And what we saw with Chris Olave, surprisingly, is he just wasn't involved. Now, look, like this could have been by design with Dallas. I don't watch the all 22 on every single game by any means, but 2 targets and 11 yards in a game where Carr threw the ball over the yard, that's a little concerning to me based off where Olave was drafted, to where if he's going to be kind of like that big slot receiver for them, Rashid Shaheed just might have better weeks in general at year's end. So I'm a little more bullish on Rashid Shaheed. I think they're a lot closer now to how we viewed them heading into week 1. So he's a guy where I might just be like, you know what? 2 targets in week 1 when your offense played that well, that's not enough for me. I might bench Olave if I've got those other options ahead of him just to see how he performs in week 2 and kind of reassess after the fact. So those are some of the guys I'm lower on. I'm kind of like, yeah, we drafted you as a starter, but we've kind of seen all we need to know just through 1 week to be like, at best right now, you're a borderline 50-50 call, and we got to start making those decisions here heading into week 2, week 3, and moving forward.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. One other thing I wanted to touch on before we move on, because the more I think about Garrett Wilson this week, right, you've got him all the way up at number 3 against that Tennessee defense. What do you think that the defensive relationship is going to be with Algerius Sneed there? Do you think Sneed shadows him, or is this more of they're going to be moving Sneed around? You're not quite as concerned about that?
I mean, I think that the Jets are going to move him around. I mean, we don't see too many like true shadow matchups where it's 24/7 snaps. I think that Garrett Wilson on talent could still win in those situations. I think as like Rodgers trusts his guys in the red zone, he's going to target, obviously Lazard as we saw in week 1, but Garrett Wilson as well. I don't want to buy too much into those things going into this week, but like it's never going to, this is a DFS conversation again. Like who would I want to spend a lot of money on as my starting wide receiver this week? So those are the things, but you're starting Garrett Wilson, and there's some other guys I'm higher on, but we'll save that for our sleeper segment a little bit towards the end.
All right, let's move on to the tight end position. The biggest story at the tight end position last week happened in the opening game of the season on Thursday night when, Isaiah Likely all of a sudden burst onto the scene with an absolutely massive game. That was almost even better if he had caught that touchdown at the end. But 12 targets for Likely, 9 receptions, 111 yards, and a touchdown. Obviously a bit of a breakout game for him, and it creates concern around Mark Andrews. You have Andrews still at number 8, Likely at number 10. I feel like we're still on a little bit of a fact-finding mission with these two. I want to start in Baltimore with the tight end conversation.
Sure.
Talk to me about your feelings there.
Yeah, so when you're looking at the rankings, what you're going to notice is when I rank them, how they score these rankings is for half PPR. So you see that as the default. If you switch to PPR, the system is going to automatically move guys around. So that's why they're 8 and 10 in PPR, because it's just based off some math, basically. But how I ranked them specifically was Andrews 7 and Likely 9. So very similar still. I just want people to know that when they sort through these, that I'm not actually hand ranking standard scoring, half PPR and PPR. It's half PPR, and then they automatically move depending on the scoring format. Still a very helpful full tool for me that I use a lot as well. But with Andrews and Likely, Dalton, at some point, sample size has to matter a little bit, right? I moved Likely all the way into the top 10. I feel like that's a decent amount. I almost laughed at myself a little bit because tight ends 1 through 11, I have no difference from the ECR on. That's rare. I have Jake Ferguson tight end 12. It says I'm higher than consensus, but there's some optimism he might play. So that's why it's an injury thing with that. But yeah, I think Brock Bowers was a pleasant surprise there too. He's kind of at the end of that tier 1. But in terms of Likely, a guy like Bowers, a guy like Likely, they're young players. They have good athletic profiles. With Baltimore, at the rate that they ran 2 tight end sets in week 1, that would have been number one in the league last year by a wide margin. And I think that Todd Monken is smart enough as a play caller to where he's like, you know what? Baltimore might have the worst receiving group in the league. I mean, Zay Flowers is a good kid. He's a good player. I mean, he's like 5'5" in high heels. You know what I mean? Like, he's a small receiver. Rachaad Bateman's been a model of inconsistency in his career. So, you know, yes, they're listed as tight end on the depth chart, but who are your best two receivers? They're Isaiah Likely and they're Mark Andrews with the size that Lamar Jackson needs. He's not the most accurate quarterback in the world, as we saw, but those bigger targets will help him to be more accurate and give him more room to make throws. So at the end of the day, look at what Andrews has done historically in his career. He's 29 years old now. He's put up a dud in almost every game against the Chiefs during the regular season and in the playoffs too. Like Steve Spagnuolo, one of the best defensive play callers in the league, he schemed Mark Andrews away. They were double teaming him almost every single play. And by default, I think that funneled a lot of volume to Likely. So I believe this is my hot take of week one. I still think Mark Andrews outscores Isaiah Likely in tight ends by the end of the year. I think that Likely should be good enough to be a consistent low-end tight end one. Can I be wrong? Absolutely, I could be wrong on this. But I still think at the very least you can start them both with a little bit of confidence. With Mark Andrews, I still think he's a top 5 tight end. It's just this week, some of the guys in that top 5 or 6, they have some pretty good matchups overall on paper. So I probably will move Andrews ahead of a Dalton Kincaid. I'm a little worried about his target share. I don't know. Kyle Pitts, he has a good matchup on paper, and he had a decent amount of usage in week one. So maybe in that kind of range of like that top 5 to 6. But I still think the locked-in top 3 is Laporta, McBride, Kelsey. And then when you're talking about tight ends 4 through tight end 10, really, Mark Andrews and Isaiah Likely, they're both in that range. And I think with Mark Andrews, like, if anything, you don't want to trade him away. You want to buy low because I don't think he's going to have as many games as low scoring as this.
All right, let's talk a little bit. Well, I guess we'll get to the defenses and the kickers later in the show. I don't think we want to really put too much time toward that right now. I want to move on to a segment you and I talked about this week that we're excited about, which is grade the trade. And there were, a couple things that you and I were texting about throughout the week, one of which is a trade that I made in one of my home leagues. I figure it gives us some good fodder to discuss, what you thought of it. This is a PPR league. I traded away Isaiah Pacheco, David Montgomery, and Jordan Addison. I acquired Garrett Wilson, Jerome Ford, and Raheem Mostert. Now, for context, this is a league in which I just lost Puka Nacua to an injury. I have Saquon Barkley at running back as well. And I know you're the first one to point out that context always matters in trades. But give me a grade here, and then we'll jump into a little bit of some buy and sell conversation for trade talks this week for our audience.
Okay, so just to be straight here, so you gave up Pacheco and Montgomery.
And Jordan Addison.
Who's hurt right now. And you got Garrett Wilson.
Yep.
And Jerome Ford. And who was the third one again?
And Raheem Mostert.
Okay, Raheem Mostert, who's out for this week at least, right? So two injured players swapped there. So basically, you gave away some running back depth. You upgraded your wide receiver position. I think if your starting lineup improves, you're going to win the trade in this scenario. Like, there's so many factors at play, right? Like, who are your other running backs, right? I know you had some good ones on that team. You were able to let go of 2 of those guys.
Yeah, so it put me in a position where I have Saquon Barkley as my other starting running back, right? David Montgomery was on my bench this week because I have 4 elite wide receivers.
Right.
So, obviously David Montgomery is far from an expendable player, and over the course of the season, that's a guy that I would have used a fair amount. But my view on a trade like this is I just lost one of my alphas in Puka Nacua.
Yeah.
And I can replace him with a consensus top 7 or 8 receiver in Garrett Wilson, who in my lineup is playing alongside Amon-Ra St. Brown, Malik Neighbors, DK Metcalf. I've got plenty of other dudes. So the way I'm looking at it, Jerome Ford is a serviceable RB2. But, the downgrade that I'm making from Pacheco to Ford, I'm okay with that in a PPR league because I'm taking on an elite alpha in Garrett Wilson, who I think is going to add to my ceiling. That's my thought.
And you're saying in this league you start 3 receivers.
No, it's two receivers and a
receivers
flex.
and a flex. So you're starting three. You want to start three receivers because you want to have a wide receiver in the flex. I think at the end of the day, you're coming away with the best player in the trade. I don't know. Again, context matters. How was the negotiation process with the person? I don't know if you needed to give up both of those guys, but I think for a guy like Garrett Wilson, maybe you had to. So I don't think the haul is that bad. I'd give you in the B range for sure. You're obviously not going to get one up on somebody when it comes to a Garrett Wilson. You're going to have to pay a decent price tag. So I like you said, you have Barkley at that position already. You're going to add Jerome Ford as your RB2 now. So you're going to upgrade your wide receiver position. I'll give you a solid B on that one, Dalton. We'll go with a B. We want to save our best grades for later in the season as we move along. And that's the tough thing with me too. It's just a personal situation and how I go about it. I'm in a keeper league, dynasty league. It's like a hybrid league, and you were in it last year. And I have Mark Andrews and Trey McBride. And I knew going into week one, I wanted to trade Mark Andrews because I want the younger upside player with McBride. Got a little busy with football going on week one. We know how that gets. I didn't put enough time into making the trade. What happens? Mark Andrews puts up a dud in week one. Now nobody wants him based off of one game, even though he has a track record of 5+ years as one of the best tight ends in the league. So at this point for me, I've been talking to some people who still are interested in Andrews, but it's really smarter for me at this point to just not do the trade this week, because if he goes out, 5 catches, 50 yards, and a touchdown, people are going to see the box score and the value is going to go up instantly, and I'm going to be able to get more. So it's a classic situation where even if you want to make a deal, you really want to try not to sell guys at their low point. And a guy like Andrews, we're going into week 2. For many people, the sample is just week 1. So you always want to try to buy low and then sell high, and not sell low and buy high at the same time.
Yeah, well, let's talk about, selling high and buying low. It sounds like Mark Andrews is a player where the buy signal is starting to flash a little bit, which, is nuts considering that you thought the sell signal was flashing last week. But that's how quickly things can change. Who are some other players who you think, we should be going out there and trying to acquire for the right price on the trade market?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just want to look overall at guys who just the box score wasn't there. And you could say that about a lot of guys in week 1. We're only 1 week into the season, so I don't want to get too crazy with this, because everyone's opinions are so much different. I think that Jaylen Warren, for example, I don't feel good about him on my team right now, and I don't want to start him, but I mean, he's not going to have the odds are that he's not going to have weeks in the future. He's too good. They're not going to give Cordell Patterson. I mean, I would hope not. Arthur Smith, cross my fingers and pray to the heavens, man. Jaylen Warren, 2 carries and 2 targets. He needs more than that. And at what point are you going to get Jaylen Warren for a cheaper price, right? That's how I look at those types of things. I almost look at it in the same way in terms of selling high on certain guys where, I mean, people might think you're crazy for wanting to sell a top 10 running back, but look at what Alvin Kamara did in week 1. Going up against maybe the worst run defense in the league, he looked like the Alvin Kamara of old, man. He was awesome, 100+ yards, scored a touchdown, was targeted. And yeah, you probably will have a good season overall. And at the end of week 1, he's RB7. I don't know, man. I still don't think the Saints are going to be all that great. There's going to be a lot more tougher matchups ahead, starting in week 2 against the Cowboys. I think Kamara, we've seen him on a multi-year decline in yards per carry efficiency. I don't just think it changed overnight. I just really think it was the Panthers defense, which is, by the way, a defense we really want to attack, which is why I'm higher on J.K. Dobbins this week. So those are just 2 examples there of I don't want to be skimming my entire league to say, who should I buy low? Who should I buy low? Because there's a lot of people that still aren't going to overreact too much to these guys' takes. But I think the older players who overperformed in week 1, and then some of the younger players who maybe underperformed in week 1, that's a good example in terms of buying low and selling high, just heading into week 2 alone. And if the usage is there, if for example, with Jaylen Warren, it was because he was hurt. That's the reason right now. That's why you'd want to buy low. If he was fully healthy, no hamstring injury headed into week 1, and he had that type of usage, we might be dropping him to the waiver wire, just keeping him as a handcuff stash alone. So those are the different exceptions I want to make. If maybe the usage wasn't there, but the guy had a hamstring injury for the last 3 weeks. Cut him a break. He's too talented to stay off the field, and that's how we're going to approach it, because you might be able to get him for basically peanuts at this point. Maybe just trade like your 5th or 6th receiver off the bench for a guy who just wants nothing to do with the Steelers offense, and that's kind of how you want to look at things across the board.
Let's talk about guys who we want to sell, guys who, maybe outperformed what you think they're going to be moving forward in week 1. Again, like you said, we want to be careful not to overreact to a sample size of one game. But who are some guys who really popped in week 1 that you think, hey, it's worth cutting bait if you can get some good value?
Yeah, I think you can. I think you can look at a number of different guys overall. It's tough to trade quarterbacks. I will say that. I think when you look at running backs overall, it's tough because J.K. Dobbins is a guy where he was a top 4 running back in week 1. He has a great matchup in week 2. So I'm not going to trade him yet. Injury prone, multiple ACL tears. I just don't know if he can make it the whole year. But if he has a couple more good weeks after this, and we start to see him pop up on the injury report, he's a guy that I would look to possibly selling. He's at Carolina this week. You're absolutely trying to start him if you can. Then he's at Pittsburgh in week 3 for the Steelers home opener. Then he's against the Chiefs. Then he has a bye week. So those are some of the things you want to look at to where he might not be the greatest start in the world after those weeks as well. I think Aaron Jones to me, I just think at his age, I love Aaron Jones, man. He's one of my favorite players of all time. He's helped win me fantasy championships in the past. And he was great in week 1. And he was the lead back. It was like that, it was the 1A, 1B, because Chandler still got some touches too. Ty Chandler in Minnesota. He's a guy, I think it's the age, he scored at least 1 touchdown or multiple touchdowns, and he overachieved. And you know what? Week 1, he's fully healthy. So those are guys I'm going to bet that they have a lesser chance of staying healthy throughout the season because of their age, because of the wear and tear on them. And those are the guys I'm going to look to sell at some point, especially when you look at Aaron Jones, he's got 2 back-to-back games against San Francisco and Houston. Then in week 5, he's got the Jets at home. Then in week 6, he's got a bye. So how many, great matchups are you going to get against the Giants in week 1 where, he scored 19 points, but the Giants might have one of the worst defense in the league. So those are guys where I'm going to start him if I got him this week, but those are some of the guys I would look to sell high on, your Aaron Joneses, your J.K. Dobbins, and things of that nature. And again, like I mentioned before, Rachaad White and Travis Etienne, they've still got that glistening, that glitter on them from being top running backs last year. Don't wait and get left holding the bag with those guys because, again, you're seeing those workloads disappear and more from lead back into committee back at best. And those are the backs you don't want on your bench because you can trade them now for much more than you might be able to trade them just in 2 weeks from now.
Makes a ton of sense. Anybody who you think we need to quit, meaning, guys that maybe you're holding on to on your bench because you've got some kind of hope for them moving forward, but you saw enough week 1 that they just really shouldn't be rostered. Obviously a guy you mentioned earlier that seems to fall into this category, a Pat Freiermuth with Pittsburgh. Who are some other guys at other positions that fall into that category for you?
Yeah, I think just going up and down the board, it just really depends on your league size and your roster size. I think with the Panthers, for example, we want to take a look at certain offenses where we don't trust them. And depending on your league size, I don't think there's many league sizes to where you want to hold on to Chuba Hubbard anymore. I would even say in a smaller, a 12-team league with short benches, a 10-team league, I don't think you want anything to do with the passing game in Carolina either. Those are some things I'm looking at in terms of Deontay Johnson and Adam Thielen. I'd be looking to cut bait on those guys, and I don't really see the upside there outside of just deeper leagues and having some type of depth on the end of your roster. So I think Carolina, for me, like really took the cake home, Dalton, in terms of just so bad quarterback play, play calling. We thought Dave Canales was going to come in and be the quarterback whisperer. And look, it's just 1 week. I get it. But that's how bad it was when you look at that overall. I would say in terms of just like fades, like the Patriots too, like, guys like Pop Douglas, he was a, popular late round pick. Jalen Polk, the rookie. We're just not seeing them have any semblance of a consistent passing game in New England. Like, I'm putting those guys on waivers until further notice because there's just better guys to pick up. I would say, like, with the Bengals, people were kind of buzzing about Andre Yosivas last week, and T. Higgins, like, is still out, but he had all the opportunity to have a big game in week 1. He didn't do it. So I'm kind of putting him back on the waivers. Like, I'd much rather go after like a young rookie who had 8 targets in Devon Vele in Denver. Just those are some of the like things I work through in my head in terms of processes, like guys I want to target, guys I'm willing to let go of. And a lot of it comes to like, again, like the age factor with a guy like Adam Thielen, aging receiver in a bad offense. Like those are 2 red flags back to back that I want to keep in mind when I'm looking to drop and cut bait on guys like that. And then some of the rookie running backs, I think you're okay to drop. Like, I don't want to drop Jalen Wright for the Dolphins, but maybe a Kamani Vidal, who I liked in the pre-draft process. Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins both came out of that game fully healthy. Kamani Vidal was a healthy scratch. So he kind of needs 2 injuries to be relevant. Maybe 1 and he gets in there. But he's the kind of guy where I'm like, you know what? Like, Ray Davis, Trey Benson, they didn't get much work in week 1, but at least they're the second string on their teams. The only guy I'm making an exception on for that is Jaylen Wright in Miami, because we've seen 2 backs be viable at the same time there. He doesn't need an injury to both of them. He just needs injury to one. So he's kind of the one guy. Like, he was a healthy scratch in week 1, but remember who was a healthy scratch in week 1 last year? Devon Etienne. You don't want to make that mistake again, especially with an explosive running back like that in his first season in the NFL.
It's a great point. That's a great point, especially on Etienne. So let's talk a little bit of sleepers. Guys who are maybe outside the top 50, top 100. Guys who might not be on anybody's radar that you think should be. And I guess we'll start with the running backs. Anybody that sticks out for you there?
Yeah, I think just looking a little bit down the board, we kind of stuck to that top 20, top 25 range when we were talking about them. But for me personally, in terms of running back, guys that are listed a little bit further down the board that I kind of buy into a little bit this week, I think Jaleel McLaughlin going up against the Pittsburgh Steelers. We saw him. He was the back that got the most touches in Denver in week 1. They need explosive players, like, because the passing game just is not it right now, with Bo Nix not being able to complete passes more than 5-10 yards down the field. So he's a guy like a little bit further down the board to where like I'm not trying to jam him into my lineup, but he's one of those guys outside the top 30 where I think there's a little bit of upside there with his athleticism and his pass catching ability and his ability to get targets. Bo Nix likes to throw to the running backs, et cetera, et cetera. Bucky Irving, for me, like a deep sleeper on your bench. Like, we saw what he did in limited time, and we heard from Todd Bowles, the coach there, that they were willing to let the hot hand ride. So 9 carries for 62 yards, averaged almost 7 yards per carry. Also got 3 targets, and he caught a lot of passes in college. So I'm not going to say he's going to take over Rachaad White's job in week 2 already, but he's a guy where if you're desperate, man, he's a guy you could throw into your flex in a high-scoring environment. We talked about the implied team totals last week. The Buccaneers are implied for 22-plus points. That game's at the top of the board with a 51.5-point over-under. So I think there's some sneaky upside there to a guy like Bucky Irving. And I'll say the same thing similarly to Tank Bigsby with the Jaguars. Like, yes, it's a tougher matchup at home against the Browns, but what if week 2 is when it happens? When Tank Bigsby all of a sudden gets 15 carries and Etienne gets 10. And we see the efficiency be much better in Bigsby's case. So he's another guy where the usage was there enough for me in week 1. The young prospect profile, the talent is there. I trust in the offensive environment enough to where, like, you know what, if I'm desperate, I'm willing to throw these guys into my flex. Maybe if I have a last-minute injury, I might just have to trust them in my RB2 spot. But you know what? Like, they're going to see probably see close to a 50% snap rate or higher, and that's going to be enough to make some big plays, possibly be involved around the goal line as well.
let's talk wide receivers as well here. Guys who you might be, guys who you're not sleeping on, who you think others might be. Looking down at the lower parts of your board, obviously I think a good place for us to start might be those Rams wide receivers in Tyler Johnson, and the other and Demarcus Robinson, right? I think those two guys are a great place to start. But who are some of the receivers that you think people are sleeping on a little bit too much?
Yeah, I think those guys. I mentioned Shaheed being a lot closer to Olave. I've got him at wide receiver 34. Tyler Johnson, Demarcus Robinson, which one can emerge, especially in that matchup, in that game environment? I like both of those guys as wide receiver 3/flex options this week. You look at a guy like Gabriel Davis, deep threat, led the Jaguars in receiving yards actually in week 1, ahead of Brian Thomas, who scored the touchdown, who I like as well for the season. And then you look at a guy like Allen Lazard. Like, look, if Allen Lazard's healthy and Aaron Rodgers trusts him, and he's got a pass funnel matchup, and opposing secondaries are going to be constantly worried about Garrett Wilson, then you know what? I mean, wide receiver 47, I know it's a lot higher than consensus has him at wide receiver 64 right now, but I think you can throw him in there if you need a guy last minute. I think you can throw Allen Lazard, to be honest, in your wide receiver 3 flex spot, wide receiver 4 in deeper leagues, etc. So those are some of the guys I'm kind of looking at. Darnell Mooney was in a full-time role for Atlanta. I think Kirk Cousins will be a little bit better in week 2, not going up against that vaunted Steelers pass rush. They're at Philly, a pass funnel secondary. Darnell Mooney, I've got as my wide receiver 51. Deep threat, can catch a chunk play for a touchdown to get you points on the board in fantasy. Those are some of the guys I'm willing to take a stab on, or maybe at the very least, like stash them on my bench because all of a sudden an injury happens, then a bye week happens, and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, I had 4 really good receivers. Now I only can play 2 of them, and I need 2 more. And guys like Darnell Mooney, guys like Gabe Davis, like those explosive type of players, those are the guys I'm willing to put in my lineup. So I like them as sleepers this week. If you're desperate, if you're in a deep enough league, to throw them into your lineup and to have some big play upside there.
Yeah, and that big play upside, it's funny how by the end of a fantasy season, when you need a plug-and-play player and they hit for that big play upside, that can win and lose you leagues. That can determine whether you end up making the playoffs or not, is pressing the right buttons on guys like that. And I know, shooting for upside is what we focus on here. We're more concerned with ceilings than floors. So good stuff there. Anything that sleepers that you want to talk about at quarterback or tight end at all?
Not too much. I think at quarterback, once you get down the board, we talked about Justin Fields being in that borderline quarterback 1 range. I think that some guys further down the board, but just not guys I really want to trust in a 1 quarterback league, to be honest, Dalton. I don't think you need to really go down to Deshaun Watson again in week 2. I don't think you need to start him. I'd hope not. Then you start getting down to Malik Willis, Bo Nix, and those guys. I'm not even wanting to start in a DFS lineup either. So I think the furthest I would go down really is that Fields range. I think that maybe one guy who performed poorly in week 1 is Kirk Cousins. We mentioned, with the matchup he's got on paper, at least, he could have a bounce back game. So I'm slightly higher than him. Aaron Rodgers, I'd probably put in that same boat. And if you're absolutely desperate, the ugliest play on the board, we want to throw – I think me or you might be able to play quarterback against the Washington Commanders, Dalton. So I might be willing to throw Daniel Jones if I'm truly 100% desperate. He could be benched in the first half, or he could get 30-plus points, which you've seen him do many times in the past. So that's the furthest, ugliest play I'm willing to go at quarterback. With tight end, it's pretty flat. I mean, Colby Parkinson I like a lot. I've moved him all the way up to tight end 13. I think he's a big beneficiary, just as Demarcus Robinson, Cooper Kupp, those guys, Tyler Johnson, those guys are all going to benefit there in the passing game. And then after him, I've still kind of got Taysom Hill, Juwan Johnson, Foster Moreau, those guys in that spot. After that, it gets really murky, and that's where I kind of want to get into the stay away territory there.
Yeah, absolutely. So okay, let's talk about guys who we want to maybe stream for this week, right?
Sure.
We talked about it a little bit with the quarterbacks and tight ends. I don't think we need to go too deep into those.
Yeah, well, I think what the sleepers kind of makes up for the sleepers, and we're kind of getting our footing here as we go along, but we can just dump into the defense and kickers and wrap it up there.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was about to go, because I think more than any other positions, and we're going to talk about this almost every week, defenses and kickers are not permanent parts of your roster, generally speaking. Maybe you'll hold on to a kicker week in and week out if they're in a good offense, but certainly the defense is a position that we want to be swapping out almost every week if we're doing this right. So
Sure.
Who are some of the defenses that you're particularly high on this week in their matchup? And then who are a couple that maybe people aren't looking at as being as obvious?
Yeah, it's a good point you bring up. It really depends on how many bench spots you have. Like I'm in a couple leagues with some deep bench spots, and I had the Chicago Bears, and they were great. They had multiple touchdowns in week 1, scored 20-something points. I don't want to start the Bears against the Texans this week on the road. However, they play the Colts and Anthony Richardson, turnover-prone quarterback, next week in week 3. So and then in week 5. They're at home against the Panthers, man. So, that's one defense where I might be willing to break my kind of standard rule of, I kind of want to keep the Bears defense on my bench just for those 2 games. You got to know your league mates. Are they going to get picked up right away if you drop into waivers? Maybe no one picks them up until next week because they see that Texans matchup. This is more something I do when it gets closer to the playoffs. I start planning ahead. But those are 2 very juicy matchups. I think the Bears actually have a Super Bowl caliber defense this year. Not offense, obviously, but defense for sure. But yeah, in terms of week 2 alone, teams I'm higher on: Chargers. We know who we want to stream against. We want to stream against Bryce Young. Colts. I want to stream against the ultimate sack machine of Malik Willis. I want that all day. There's a slight chance Jordan Love can play this week. I don't think it's going to happen. They were talking about it earlier today that if he's ready, he can go. The classic line that we hear. We'll see about that. If Malik Willis is starting at quarterback, I'm streaming a defense against them. I picked up the Colts in almost all my leagues this week just for that reason alone. I want to stream against, the Bengals kind of dudded last week, streaming against the Patriots. I'm going to trust the Seahawks to have a little bit better performance against Jacoby Brissett in company there. And then the Texans, man, at home against the aforementioned Bears, Caleb Williams struggled a lot. Shane Waldron, he might be the worst offensive coordinator in the league. Keenan Allen's hurt right now. Rome Odunze's hurt. Man, the Bears offense might be trouble. That might be an under I might be looking to bet. And I'm looking to fade Chicago offensive players this week on the whole, maybe outside of just DJ Moore. So the Texans, I think, have big upside against a rookie quarterback who's still prone to make mistakes. Jacksonville against Deshaun Watson at home. Those are the guys I want to target. I want to target those quarterbacks. Maybe the Washington Commanders, if you're truly desperate, playing at home against Daniel Jones, although that is one where I'd much rather start those other defenses that I mentioned. I'd probably still rather start the Packers defense against Anthony Richardson, but Packers, Commanders in that range where they're kind of the middle tier, but they still have those really juicy kind of turnover touchdown potential matchups on paper as well.
Yeah, the Jaguars were the one that really stuck out to me. I picked them up in a couple different leagues.
Yeah.
Just because what we saw from Cleveland last week with Deshaun Watson, and then you add in the continued legal struggles this week, where that's all we're hearing about in Cleveland. And I think they're getting to a point in Cleveland where I don't care how much you're paying the guy. At a certain point, can you continue to put that product out onto the field and all the baggage that comes with it? I have a feeling. One of my hottest NFL takes at the moment, I have a feeling we're going to see Jameis Winston by week 4. That's just my feeling on it. And I think this game against Jacksonville is going to be another step toward that.
And Jameis Winston loves to throw interceptions. So you're going to I think the Browns offense will be better, but I actually think there could be more turnover potential for fantasy defenses in that case. So we could actually see a win-win in that scenario with Jameis Winston playing there.
Sounds good. Well, that'll do it for week 2. With about an hour and 8 minutes. So not too bad, maybe a little longer than we were planning, but a lot of good information, lot of takeaways after week 1. It's nice to have some actual data to look at here. But Chris, any last words for the people before we hang them up?
No, I post my weekly recap thread, usually Sunday night, early Monday, looking at the PFF data in terms of the routes, snaps, things like that, target shares. I post my biggest takeaways on all 32 teams, so make sure to check out my Twitter for that. It's @MaddJournalist, @MaddJournalist. You can catch my rankings. They'll be live on every Thursday at the Post-Gazette website, which is post-gazette.com. Make sure to check out our other great content, the rest of our episodes here on the North Shore Drive podcast. And again, if you're playing in a league with kickers, just pull up the NFL implied team totals. look top to bottom, and those are the kickers you want to be starting about. We don't want to spend more than 30 seconds talking about him here on this show. I've got Jake Moody as my number one kicker. You know what? The Lions kicker, start him too, because they're the number one team in terms of implied team points on the week. Over 29 points the Lions are supposed to score this week, at least according to the Vegas betting spread in the market there. So that's how you want to do that. But no, that pretty much wraps up everything, Dalton. It was good talking. And we'll continue to get this format kind of ironed out as the Pittsburghers here say over time, because there's a lot of trade potential to talk about this early in the year, a lot of waiver wire potential. There's still a lot we don't know. Just like we said we were going to throw away our draft priors heading into week 2, or at least some of them. We're going to throw away our week 2 priors heading into week 3 next week. We're going to have even more data to capitalize on. So it's going to be a fun weekend, man. I'm excited about it.
Absolutely. Well, thanks everybody so much for tuning in. Again, that's Chris Dell at MADD Journalist, Mad Journalist on Twitter. You can find me at Dalton on Sports. I'll be rambling every once in a while about what I'm watching as well. Probably not sharing as much data as Chris, though. So make sure you're following Chris. And we look forward to talking with you next week.
Likewise. Peace out.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all the sports coverage from the Post-Gazette that we have to offer, visit post-gazette.com.